was just another ordinary day for me, or so I thought. I had been living my life in a bubble of luxury, surrounded by people who either wanted something from me or were too intimidated to treat me like a normal person. I was Evelyn Carter, the heiress to the Carter fortune, a name that carried weight in every room I walked into. But that evening, as I sat alone at a corner table in a small, dimly lit Italian restaurant, I felt a strange emptiness. The restaurant wasn't one of my usual spots. Those were too predictable, too full of people who knew who I was. This place was different. It was cozy, unpretentious, and far removed from the glitz and glamour of my world. I had stumbled upon it by accident, seeking solace from the chaos of my life. The waiter who approached my table was unlike anyone I had ever met. He had a warm smile, the kind that reached his eyes, and a calm demeanor that instantly put me at ease. His name tag read Liam, and as he handed me the menu, our fingers brushed for a brief moment, sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about him that felt real. He didn't treat me like a billionaire or a celebrity. He treated me like a person. When he spoke, his voice was soft but confident, and he had a way of making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I ordered the simplest dish on the menu, partly because I wasn't very hungry and partly because I wanted to see how he would react. He didn't bat an eye, simply nodding and saying, "Great choice." It's one of my favorites. As he walked away, I found myself watching him, intrigued by the way he moved, graceful yet unassuming. The food arrived quickly and it was delicious, but my attention kept drifting back to Liam. He was attentive without being overbearing, and there was a quiet strength about him that I couldn't quite place. By the time I finished my meal, I realized I didn't want to leave. I lingered at the table, sipping my wine and stealing glances at him whenever he wasn't looking. When he finally brought the check, I hesitated before handing him my card. "Thank you," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He smiled again, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of something I couldn't quite name. As I left the restaurant, I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was the beginning of something different. Little did I know, Liam would soon change my life in ways I could never have imagined. I couldn't stop thinking about him. The waiter with the warm smile and the quiet confidence. It was ridiculous, really. I was Evelyn Carter, a woman who had dined with CEOs, celebrities, and politicians, and yet here I was, obsessing over a man who worked in a small, unremarkable restaurant. But there was something about him that lingered in my mind, like a melody I couldn't quite place. A week after our first encounter, I found myself back at the restaurant, telling myself it was because I craved the pasta I had ordered that night. But deep down I knew the truth. I wanted to see him again. The moment I walked in, my eyes scanned the room, searching for him. My heart skipped a beat when I spotted him near the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows as he carried a tray of dishes. He looked up and our eyes met. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Then he smiled, that same warm, genuine smile, and walked over to greet me. "Welcome back," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm glad you decided to return." I felt a flutter in my chest, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. He led me to the same corner table, and as I sat down, I noticed how effortlessly he moved, how natural he seemed in this space. I ordered the same dish again, partly because I genuinely enjoyed it and partly because I wanted to see if he would remember. He did. "The spaghetti aglio e olio, right?" he asked, and I nodded, surprised and oddly touched. As he walked away, I found myself wondering about his life. Who was he outside of this restaurant? What were his dreams, his fears, his passions? I had never been this curious about someone before, and it both excited and unnerved me. When he returned with my food, I decided to take a risk. "Do you always remember your customers' orders?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound that made my stomach flip. "Only the ones who leave an impression," he replied, his eyes meeting mine. I felt my cheeks flush, and I quickly looked down at my plate, suddenly unsure of what to say. The rest of the meal passed in a blur, but I couldn't stop stealing glances at him. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he interacted with the other staff and customers, that fascinated me. He was kind but not overly familiar, confident but not arrogant. When it was time to leave, I hesitated again, not wanting the evening to end. As I handed him my card, I found myself saying, "I'll be back." He smiled and nodded. "I'll be here." Those 3 words stayed with me long after I left the restaurant, echoing in my mind like a promise. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a journey that would change everything I thought I knew about love, life, and myself. The third time I visited the restaurant, I told myself it would be the last. I couldn't keep coming back like this, couldn't keep letting this man occupy so much of my thoughts. But as soon as I walked through the door and saw him, all my resolve melted away. Liam was standing near the bar, polishing glasses, and when he saw me, his face lit up with that same warm smile. "You're becoming a regular," he said as he approached me. I laughed, a sound that felt foreign to my own ears. "I guess I am," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. He led me to my usual table, but this time instead of handing me the menu, he paused. "Can I make a suggestion?" he asked. I nodded, intrigued. "The chef makes a special risotto on Thursdays. It's not on the menu, but it's incredible." I agreed without hesitation, and as he walked away, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. When he returned with the dish, he lingered for a moment as if he wanted to say something. I decided to take the leap. "Do you ever sit down with your customers?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He looked surprised but not uncomfortable. "Not usually," he said, "but for you I can make an exception." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, and for the first time I felt like I was seeing him as more than just a waiter. We started talking and the conversation flowed effortlessly. He told me about growing up in a small town, about his love for cooking, and about how he ended up in the city. I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't with anyone else. I told him about the pressures of my life, about how lonely it felt to always be surrounded by people but never truly connected to anyone. He listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished he said something that took my breath away. "You don't have to carry all that alone, you know." His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within me. For the first time in years I felt understood. We talked for hours, long after the restaurant had emptied out. He told me about his dreams of opening his own place someday, a small cafe where people could feel at home. I told him about my passion for art, something I had buried under the weight of my responsibilities. By the time we finally said goodbye, I felt like I had known him forever. As I walked to my car, I realized something had shifted inside me. Liam wasn't just a waiter anymore. He was someone who had seen me, truly seen me, and for the first time in my life I felt like I didn't have to pretend. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I knew then that this wasn't just a passing fascination. Liam had awakened something in me, something I had thought was long gone. And I had no idea what to do about it. The days that followed our conversation at the restaurant were a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't stop thinking about Liam, about the way he made me feel seen and heard. But as much as I wanted to see him again, I couldn't ignore the reality of our differences. I was Evelyn Carter, a billionaire heiress with a life that revolved around board meetings, charity galas, and endless obligations. He was Liam, a waiter with dreams of opening his own cafe, living a life that was simple and unpretentious. The contrast between our worlds was stark, and it weighed heavily on my mind. I found myself questioning whether it was fair to drag him into my complicated life, whether I had the right to disrupt his world with my chaos. But despite my doubts, I couldn't stay away. I returned to the restaurant again, this time with a mix of excitement and apprehension. When I walked in, Liam was there as always, and his face lit up when he saw me. "You're back," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. I smiled, but there was a nervousness in my chest that I couldn't shake. We fell into our usual rhythm, but this time, there was an unspoken tension between us. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, in the way his hand lingered on the back of my chair as he seated me. After I ordered, he surprised me by sitting down at my table again. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, his tone serious. "About what you said about feeling alone." I felt my breath catch in my throat. "And?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want you to feel that way anymore," he said. His words were like a balm to my soul, but they also filled me with a sense of dread. How could I explain to him the complexities of my life, the expectations that came with my name? I wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the truth of who I was, but I was afraid. Afraid that he would see me differently, that he would pull away. Instead, I said nothing, and the moment passed. But as I left the restaurant that night, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the truth. Liam was becoming too important to me, and if I wanted this to go anywhere, I had to be honest with him. The thought terrified me, but it also gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could accept me for who I was, billionaire baggage and all. The next time I saw Liam, I decided it was time to tell him the truth. I couldn't keep hiding who I was, not when he had been so open and honest with me. I arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual, hoping to catch him before the dinner rush. He was setting up tables when I walked in, and his face broke into a smile as soon as he saw me. "You're early," he said, his tone light and teasing. I forced a smile, but my nerves were getting the better of me. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He must have sensed the seriousness in my tone because his expression shifted, and he nodded. "Of course," he said, leading me to a quiet corner of the restaurant. We sat down, and for a moment I just stared at him, trying to find the right words. "Liam," I began, my heart pounding in my chest, "there's something I need to tell you." He waited patiently, his eyes never leaving mine. I took a deep breath and plunged in. "I'm not who you think I am," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Evelyn Carter, and I'm the heiress to the Carter fortune." There. I had said it. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unyielding. Liam's expression didn't change at first, and for a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. But then he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Evelyn Carter," he repeated as if testing the name on his tongue. I braced myself for his reaction, for the disappointment or disbelief that was sure to follow. But instead he surprised me. "I know," he said simply. I stared at him, stunned. "You know?" I stammered. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I recognized you the first time you walked in here," he admitted. "But I didn't say anything because I wanted you to have the chance to just be yourself." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice shaking. He shrugged, his expression softening. "Because it didn't matter to me," he said. "You're still the same person I've been getting to know. The money, the name, none of that changes who you are." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I quickly blinked them away. For the first time in my life, someone had seen past the fortune, past the fame, and straight to the heart of who I was. It was both terrifying and liberating. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I'm just glad you trusted me enough to tell me." In that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, one I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Liam had accepted me not in spite of who I was, but because of it. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be real. After I told Liam the truth about who I was, something shifted between us. It wasn't just that he knew my name or my background. It was the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me. There was a new level of understanding, a deeper connection that I hadn't realized was missing before. But with that connection came a new set of challenges. I found myself wanting to spend more time with him, to learn everything about him, but I was also acutely aware of how different our lives were. He worked long hours at the restaurant, while my schedule was filled with meetings, events, and obligations that I couldn't just ignore. So we made it work. I started visiting the restaurant more often, sometimes just to sit at the bar and watch him work. He would steal glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking, and every time our eyes met, I felt a thrill run through me. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, he invited me to stay behind. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. I agreed without hesitation, curious to see what he had in mind. He led me to the kitchen, a place I had never been before, and gestured for me to sit at the counter. "I'm going to cook for you," he said, his eyes sparkling. I watched in awe as he moved around the kitchen, his hands deft and sure as he chopped, stirred, and seasoned. It was like watching an artist at work, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. When he finally placed the dish in front of me, I was speechless. It was a simple pasta dish, but it was unlike anything I had ever tasted. The flavors were bold and complex, yet perfectly balanced. "This is amazing," I said, my voice filled with genuine admiration. He smiled, clearly pleased with my reaction. "Cooking is my passion," he said. "It's how I express myself." As I ate, we talked about his dreams, about the cafe he wanted to open someday. I found myself getting caught up in his enthusiasm, in the way he spoke about his vision. "You should do it," I said, my voice firm. "You have the talent, the drive. You could make it happen." He looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "It's not that simple," he said. "Opening a place like that takes money, connections, things I don't have." I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that I had access to all those things and more. But I didn't want to overstep, didn't want to make him feel like he needed me to succeed. So I simply nodded and said, I believe in you. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and conversation, and by the time I left, I felt closer to him than ever. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that our worlds were still so far apart. I wanted to bridge that gap, to find a way to bring our lives together, but I didn't know how. All I knew was that I was falling for him, more deeply than I had ever thought possible, and that scared me more than I cared to admit. It wasn't long before Liam asked me out on a proper date. I had been waiting for this moment, both excited and nervous about what it would mean for us. He suggested we go to a small family-owned bakery on the other side of town, a place he had discovered during his days off. It's nothing fancy, he warned me, but the pastries are incredible. I didn't care about fancy. I just wanted to spend time with him outside the confines of the restaurant. When the day came, I found myself staring at my closet, unsure of what to wear. I didn't want to look like I was trying too hard, but I also didn't want to seem like I didn't care. In the end, I settled on a simple dress and a pair of flats, something that felt like me but not overly extravagant. When I arrived at the bakery, Liam was already there waiting for me outside. He looked different in casual clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, and I felt a flutter in my chest as I approached him. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice warm and sincere. I smiled, feeling a blush creep up my cheeks. "Thank you," I replied, my voice soft. We went inside and the smell of freshly baked bread and pastries enveloped us. Liam ordered for us, choosing a variety of treats to share, and we found a small table near the window. As we ate, we talked about everything and nothing, our favorite foods, childhood memories, books we loved. It was easy and natural, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Afterward, we walked through the nearby park, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet. The air was crisp and the sky was a brilliant shade of blue. Liam reached for my hand and I let him take it, his fingers intertwining with mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental, like a silent acknowledgement of what was growing between us. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Me too," I replied, my heart swelling with emotion. As the day turned into evening, we found ourselves sitting on a bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known I was missing. "Evelyn," he said after a long silence, "I know our lives are different, but I want you to know that I'm in this. Whatever this is, I'm all in." His words took my breath away and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I'm in this too," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. In that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could bridge the gap between our worlds. As much as I wanted to keep Liam and my life separate, I knew it was only a matter of time before they collided. That moment came sooner than I expected. One evening, I was attending a charity gala, one of those obligatory events I couldn't avoid. It was the usual crowd, wealthy, influential, and entirely predictable. I was standing near the bar, sipping a glass of champagne and trying to look interested in the conversation around me when I saw him. He was there, dressed in a waiter's uniform, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. My heart stopped. What was he doing here? I hadn't told him about the event, and I certainly hadn't expected to see him. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. I could see the surprise in his expression, the way his jaw tightened as he realized where he was. I wanted to go to him to explain, but before I could, someone called my name. "Evelyn. There you are." It was Margaret, one of the board members of the charity, and she was heading straight for me. I plastered on a smile and turned to greet her, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept glancing over her shoulder, trying to catch Liam's eye, but he had already disappeared into the crowd. The rest of the evening was a blur. I tried to focus on the conversations around me, but all I could think about was Liam. Had I hurt him by not telling him about the event? Had I made him feel like I was ashamed of him? The thought made my stomach churn. As soon as I could, I excused myself and went looking for him. I found him in the kitchen helping to clean up. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "Liam," I said, my voice trembling, "I didn't know you'd be here." He nodded, but his eyes were guarded. "It's fine," he said, his tone neutral. "It's just work." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "It's not fine," I said. "I should have told you about this. I didn't want to make things awkward." He set down the tray he was holding and turned to face me. Evelyn, he said, his voice soft but firm, I know our worlds are different. I get that. But if this is going to work, we can't keep hiding from each other's realities. His words hit me like a punch to the gut and I felt tears well up in my eyes. You're right, I whispered. I'm sorry. He reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. It's okay, he said. We'll figure it out. Together. In that moment, I realized how much I had been holding back, how much I had been trying to protect him, and myself, from the complexities of my life. But Liam wasn't asking for protection. He was asking for honesty, for a chance to be part of my world, no matter how messy it was. And for the first time, I felt ready to let him in. Despite our growing connection, the differences in our lives began to surface in ways I hadn't anticipated. It started with something small. A missed phone call. I had been in back-to-back meetings all day, and by the time I checked my phone, I had 3 missed calls from Liam. I called him back as soon as I could, but he sounded distant, his tone clipped and formal. I just wanted to see if you were free for dinner, he said, his voice lacking its usual warmth. I felt a pang of guilt. I'm so sorry, I said. Work has been insane today. Can we reschedule? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his words caught me off guard. It's always work with you, Evelyn, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. I get that your life is busy, but sometimes it feels like I'm not a priority. His words stung and I felt a surge of defensiveness. That's not fair, I said, my voice rising. You know how much my work means to me. I can't just drop everything whenever you want me to. The conversation escalated quickly, our voices growing louder and more strained. By the time we hung up, I was shaking with anger and frustration. How could he not understand the demands of my life? How could he expect me to just put everything aside for him? But as the hours passed, my anger began to fade, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been so focused on my own world that I hadn't made enough space for him in it. The next day I went to the restaurant, determined to make things right. Liam was in the kitchen, and when he saw me, his expression was guarded. Can we talk? Asked, my voice soft. He nodded and led me to a quiet corner. I'm sorry, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I shouldn't have snapped at you. You're right, I haven't been making enough time for us, and that's not fair to you. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought he might pull away. But then he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I'm sorry too, he said. I shouldn't have lashed out at you. I know your life is complicated and I don't want to make it harder for you. His words melted the last of my defenses, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I don't want to lose you, I whispered, my voice breaking. He reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. You're not going to lose me, he said. But we need to figure out how to make this work. We can't keep pretending like our lives don't matter to each other. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. We still had a long way to go, but in that moment I knew we were both committed to making it work. And for the first time I felt like we were truly in this together. After our fight, Liam and I made a conscious effort to bridge the gap between our worlds. It wasn't easy, but we both knew it was necessary if we wanted our relationship to survive. I decided to take the first step by inviting him to one of my charity events. It wasn't a gala or a high-profile fundraiser, just a small gathering at a local community center where I was hosting a workshop for underprivileged kids. I thought it would be a good way to introduce him to my world without overwhelming him. When I asked him, he hesitated for a moment, but then he smiled and said, I'd love to. The day of the event, I was nervous. I kept wondering if he would feel out of place, if he would regret coming. But when he arrived, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, he looked calm and confident. I introduced him to a few of my colleagues, and to my relief they were warm and welcoming. Liam, for his part, was charming and attentive, asking thoughtful questions and engaging in conversation. As the event got underway, I watched him interact with the kids and my heart swelled with pride. He had a natural way with them, making them laugh and feel at ease. At one point, I caught him helping a little boy with his art project, his patience and kindness shining through. It was in that moment that I realized how much he had to offer, not just to me but to the world. After the event, we went for a walk, the cool evening air a welcome relief after the busy day. You were amazing today, I said, my voice filled with admiration. He smiled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. I'm glad I came, he said. But I have to admit it was a little intimidating. I felt a pang of guilt. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't mean to put you in an uncomfortable position. He shook his head. No, it's not that. It's just, your world is so different from mine. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever really fit in. His words struck a chord and I reached for his hand. You don't have to fit in, I said. You just have to be yourself. That's all I want. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought he might say something more. But then he simply nodded and squeezed my hand. Thank you for including me, he said. As we walked back to the car, I felt a sense of hope. We had taken a step forward, and even though there were still challenges ahead, I knew we were moving in the right direction. Liam had shown me that he was willing to step into my world, and I was determined to do the same for him. Together we were building something real, something that could withstand the differences that had once seemed insurmountable. One evening, as we sat in Liam's tiny apartment sharing a homemade meal, he brought up the topic of his dream cafe again. It had been a while since we talked about it, and I could see the passion in his eyes as he described his vision. I want it to be a place where people feel at home, he said, his voice filled with excitement. Somewhere they can come to relax, to connect, to just be themselves. I listened intently, my heart swelling with pride. He had so much talent, so much potential, and I wanted nothing more than to see him succeed. But I also knew that starting a business was no small feat, especially for someone like Liam who didn't have the financial backing or connections that I did. What's stopping you? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Money mostly, he admitted. And I don't even know where to start with finding a location, getting permits, all that stuff. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how he would react to what I was about to say. What if I helped you? I asked, my voice tentative. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. What do you mean? I took a deep breath. I mean, I could invest in your cafe. Help you get it off the ground. There was a long silence, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. On one hand, he wanted this more than anything. On the other, he didn't want to feel like he owed me anything. Evelyn, he said finally, his voice soft but firm, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I replied. I'm offering. As I believe in you, Liam. I believe in your dream. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought he might refuse. But then he smiled, a slow, grateful smile that made my heart skip a beat. Thank you, he said, his voice choked with emotion. But only if we do this as partners. I don't want this to be a handout. I nodded, feeling a surge of relief. Partners, I agreed. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into the project. I used my connections to help him find a location, and together we worked on the design, the menu, the branding. It was exhausting but exhilarating, and I loved seeing Liam's passion come to life. The day we signed the lease for the space, he turned to me with a look of pure joy. I can't believe this is really happening, he said. I smiled, feeling a sense of pride that was almost overwhelming. It's happening, I replied. And it's going to be amazing. As we stood there, surrounded by the empty space that would soon be his cafe, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just his dream anymore. It was ours. And for the first time I felt like we were truly building a future together. The grand opening of Liam's cafe, which we decided to call the Humble Table, was a day I'll never forget. The place was packed with people. Friends, family, curious locals, and even a few of my colleagues who had come to show their support. The air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread, roasted coffee, and Liam's signature dishes. I stood near the counter, watching him move through the crowd with ease, his smile radiant as he greeted guests and thanked them for coming. He looked so at home, so in his element, and I felt a surge of pride knowing I had played a small part in making this dream come true. At one point, he caught my eye and motioned for me to join him in the kitchen. I followed him, curious, and found myself standing in front of a small cake with a single candle. What's this? I asked, my voice filled with surprise. He smiled, his eyes soft and full of emotion. This is my way of saying thank you, he said. For believing in me, for supporting me, for being my partner in all of this. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but before I could respond, he continued. Evelyn, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me that love isn't about where you come from or what you have. It's about who you are. And I love you for who you are, not for your name or your money, but for your heart. His words took my breath away and I felt a lump form in my throat. I love you too, I whispered, my voice trembling. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. I know our worlds are different, he said, but I don't care. As long as I have you, I have everything I need. In that moment I realized how far we had come. We had faced challenges, fought battles, and overcome obstacles, but through it all we had stayed true to each other. Our love had transcended the boundaries of our worlds, proving that it wasn't about where we came from but where we were going. As we stood there, surrounded by the warmth and chaos of the cafe, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. This was our new beginning, a life built on love, trust, and mutual respect. And as I looked into Liam's eyes, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, music, and celebration. But the moment that stayed with me, the one I would carry in my heart forever, was the look on Liam's face as he stood in the center of his dream, knowing he had made it a reality. And as I watched him, I realized that he had changed my life just as much as I had changed his. He had shown me that love isn't about perfection. It's about finding someone who sees you, truly sees you, and loves you for who you are. And in Liam I had found that person. As the night drew to a close, we stood outside the cafe, hand in hand, looking up at the sign that bore his dream. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but steady. "For everything." I smiled, feeling a sense of contentment I hadn't known was possible. "Thank you," I replied, "for showing me what love really means." And as we walked away into the quiet of the night, I knew that this was just the beginning of our story. A story of love, hope, and two people who had found each other against all odds.